This is the second screenshot video in the crimes course, and we're focusing now on the New York State criminal court system. And what I mean by criminal court system, we're only identifying courts in New York that handle or process criminal cases. So, by way of example, you're not going to see surrogates court, which administers estates and deals with the legal issues that could arise from estates, or the Court of Claims of New York, which handles monetary claims made against the state or one of its agencies. So I'm looking at the kind of the bottom, and we'll go from the bottom to the top. At our local level, we have our city, town, and village courts. And so every city in New York State has a city court that handles, among other things, criminal cases. A lot of these courts handle civil cases too, but our focus is on criminal cases. So there's the Buffalo City Court, the Lockport City Court, Rochester City Court, Albany City Court, and so on. And then we have town and village courts. Every town has a criminal court. Some villages do have criminal courts, some don't, and that's due to governmental decisions that have been made at the level of town and villages. In other words, villages in New York State are part of or parts of a town. So we do have the Village Court of Williamsville, which happens to be located in the town of Amherst, and we have a town of Amherst court. The Village of Blaisdell, which is located in the town of Cheektowaga, does not have a criminal court. It used to, but it doesn't. I'm sorry, when I said Blaisdell, I meant to say Sloan. My apologies. The Village of Sloan does not have a criminal court. It used to, because that's where I represented my first defendant. And so all of those cases that once were previously handled in the Village of Sloan, along with a lot of other cases outside the Village of Sloan, but in the town of Cheektowaga, are handled in the town of Cheektowaga court. So we have our city, town, and village courts. Local courts. Our superior courts, we have throughout the state, New York State Supreme Court, and also each county outside of the five New York City counties has a county court. So we have the Erie County Court, we have the Orleans County Court, and so on. Now, I've labeled these first two levels as trial courts, and that simply means that's where criminal cases either start out or are processed before we reach and until we reach one of those four dispositions that we talked about in the first posting and the first screenshot video. So by way of example, a person might be charged in Buffalo City Court with a misdemeanor offense of shoplifting. And so, and then we'll see later on, a person might be charged in Erie County Court with homicide. But these are our trial courts, and this is the two levels, or these are the two levels where we have those dispositions. Then in New York State, we have appellate courts, and we have the Appellate Division of State Supreme Court. That court is organized geographically into four judicial departments. So in Buffalo, by way of example, we are in the fourth judicial department, which is headquartered, as we like to say in the law, the court sits in Rochester, New York. And then our highest court in New York is the New York Court of Appeals, which is in the state capital, Albany. Now, just sort of a footnote here, notice that in New York State, we don't label our highest court Supreme Court. In the United States, in our federal court system, of course, the highest court is the U.S. Supreme Court. Some of the states in their court system have called their highest court Supreme Court, but in New York, it's historically been called and remains the Court of Appeals. The other point I want to make is that sometimes, as we're going to see when we work our way through the New York court system, the county court also can act as an appellate court. And if we scroll down, we're now looking at how misdemeanors and violations are handled in New York. And if you'll remember, they are the least serious offenses. Think maybe shoplifting, misdemeanor, disorderly conduct, example of violation. Those misdemeanor and violation cases go to city, town, or if there is one, the village court. And they are predicated on where the defendant allegedly committed the misdemeanor in violation. So if a person was in the Walden Galleria and is charged with shoplifting, their misdemeanor case would go to the town of Cheektowaga Court. At that level of city, town, or village court, a disposition is reached, and that's one of the 4 dispositions that we talked about above. And the possibility then exists after the disposition is reached that there's going to be an appeal. And the appeal is going to be taken to county court, except in New York City, and we're not going to worry about that for our purposes in this court. So that person who's been convicted, let's say in the town of Cheektowaga Court, if that defendant appeals, the appeal will go to Erie County Court. After the county court determines the appeal, the losing party, so to speak, may wish to appeal higher. And if they do, that appeal is taken to the highest court in New York, Court of Appeals. You'll see I have here in the margin, appeal by permission. In the New York Court of Appeals doesn't have to consider the appeal, so the party who wants to appeal to the Court of Appeals in this context of misdemeanors and violations must first obtain permission from the court to hear the appeal. So you've got to convince the court, if you will, that the appeal is worth considering. That's probably going to be based on the ability to identify an issue in the case that is significant enough for the Court of Appeals to consider. So it's probably an issue coming up for the first time. I remember a case where the law enforcement put a GPS kind of device on a person's car, excuse me, and that led to a decision by the Court of Appeals. But as you can see, that given the change in technology, that was kind of a first-time issue. What we could say is that once the county court decides an appeal, likely that ends the case, at least in the New York State court system. The ability to go to federal court will be something we'll take a look at later. If we move on, we find ourselves at the level of felonies. And again, if you'll remember, the most serious cases, most serious of cases. So think murder by way of example. Now, when we look at felony cases, we have to introduce a new actor in the system, and that is the grand jury. And each county has a grand jury in place, and the role of the grand jury is to consider whether a person should be charged with a felony. If the person is charged with a felony, the grand jury issues what is known as an indictment. But what typically happens is this: if a person is accused of a felony by law enforcement, that felony case will go initially to city, town, or if there is one, a village court, depending upon location for city, town, or village court. And the judge at that level will preside over what's known as a felony or a preliminary hearing, simply to determine whether there's a reason to believe that A, felony was committed, and B, that the defendant is the individual who committed the felony. So notice it's not a determination of guilt or not guilt. If the judge concludes that there's a probable cause or reasonable cause, as I've indicated, then the defendant is held for action by the grand jury and the case is transferred to the grand jury. The grand jury is a body of 25 people selected for jury duty. What happens at the grand jury, it's not at all like a trial. There's no judge in the room. There's a prosecutor in the room. There's the grand jurors in the room. There's a clerk taking down all of the stuff that happens. The prosecutor presents evidence, witness testimony, or other types of evidence, lab reports, and the like. And there's no defense attorney there, and the defendant isn't there. So it's kind of a one-sided affair. And the grand jury, after the prosecutor introduces the proof, the prosecutor will ask the grand jury to vote, and it's a majority vote that rules, to issue an indictment. Occasionally, not often, but occasionally, there's no initial foray into city, town, or village, but law enforcement and the prosecutor's office, of course, directly presents proof of a felony to the grand jury. So that first stage is skipped over. Why would this happen? Oftentimes it happens where there's an ongoing investigation with, let's say, an undercover agent. And if the charge was brought against a particular defendant in the city, town, or village court, it would blow the identity of the undercover agent. And so to protect against that, it's not the only instance, but it's a classic instance. The evidence is directly presented to the grand jury, and it's the same grand jury process I've described. Grand jury is asked to vote and typically follows the recommendation of the district attorney and will issue an indictment. A judge once famously said in New York State that a district attorney could probably persuade the grand jury to indict a ham sandwich, so it's not surprising to see, and I don't think particularly wrong in most instances, to observe that when evidence goes to a grand jury, there's probably going to be an indictment. If there is an indictment, it is then the case, which is falling under the indictment, is sent to either state Supreme Court or county court. That's an administrative decision. Both courts, state Supreme Court and county court, have the power or the jurisdiction to handle the felony case at this point. What we're going to find in our more rural counties, I'm thinking of where I grew up, Ontario County, or even if we went down to Cattaraugus County by way of example, the county court gets most of the criminal cases. In Erie County, Monroe County, Albany County, where there's a large population in the county, oftentimes we'll see that not only do felony cases get sent to county court, but also to a judge on the state Supreme Court. But it's at that level, either state Supreme Court or county court, where a disposition is reached. We're going to continue this in our next screenshot video.